on a very sunny day in Brockley. Great to be back with Andy Worthington.
Hi.
It's been a frenetically busy month, but it's always very chilled in here. I really admire your work-life balance of a weekend. So, there are people, as we were saying off mic, who not least your good self, as much as possible, who get on out there and campaign and befriend and discover things. I have a new person on our team, as I mentioned earlier on, Pamela Mounter, who has gotten involved in a campaign around HMP Wandsworth, but with the ambition of wider ripples about the state of the prison service, on the back of somebody having escaped there who was on remand last month, with about whom terrorism, whatever you make of that, was one of the cases to be eventually tried. Reports of giant rats, reports of conditions and suicides and drugs coming in, and made me think about this is the Quakers, of course. This made me think about they, as an embattled party themselves, with a recent sort of neo-Gazan student raid on the Euston Road, are potentially a force majeure, a moral, cultural force majeure in our society now. That where some people feel a little bit lost, a bit disempowered, a bit politically homeless, so there's that. But also what you make of what we do with prison reform and where it went, and whether it's something that is ripe for revival when people are being locked up for all kinds of things that were never thought to be crimes before.
Yeah, well, it's all a very good topic, and I'm glad to hear you've got a new collaborator who's looking at this. There are so many aspects to the story, aren't there? I mean, the first thing that struck me when you were speaking there was the Quakers, and the Quakers, anti-war, anti-punishment, really carrying a flag still, I think, for the kind of reforms that took place from the late 19th century into the 20th century, which are the basis for most of what we recognise as living in a civilized civil society. It's really kind of impossible to underestimate how significant reformers were in that period.
So
many of the people that were significant in establishing, housing, education, health, so many things that are so important to us, and obviously attempts to reform the prison system from what it was. The prisons throughout human history have been grotesque places. We used to have regular executions that were a huge attraction for the population. The Strictly Come Dancing of their time.
Yes.
And the life that we've lived, Andy, of course, the abolition of the death penalty happened, which was extremely significant. But prisons are, overcrowded. No one has fundamentally, for a very long time, been able to mobilise any kind of position for the reform of the prison system, on the basis, I would say that, first of all, what I've noticed for a long time is that Britain tops the league for per capita imprisonment in Europe. That's not a good league to be the top of. I mean, of course, it pales in comparison to the United States, which imprisons so many people per capita. But we shouldn't be at the top of that list. We should be working out how we can move down the list. Why are we imprisoning people who aren't violent? I mean, that's my fundamental starting point. We shouldn't be spending money and destroying the life chances for people after they're released, when they didn't pay a bill, or they so many people are in prison for reasons that are absolutely so far removed from posing a threat to society that it's absurd. And that's, another thing I would touch on. I know that the investigative journalist Nick Davis did a big study. I think at the end of the 80s, early 90s, like a 3-year study into prisons, in which he established that the majority of people that are in prisons have got mental health issues. That's why they ended up in prison. That's why they got involved in criminal activities. So the whole thing really could do with a drastic rethink. But the problem was, as always, is that every single government that we get is, far right when it comes to law and order. And they kind of feel like they say that they're mirroring or they're echoing what people think. But is it what people think, or is it that there's a steady drip feed from the right-wing media about punishment? Nothing about rehabilitation and nothing about a sense of proportionality. So,
because in the end, when these people are released or escape, has to be said, they have to do something with their lives. I mean, I dug out a clip of Jimmy Boyle, who was an extremely violent man, who met and fell in love with his social worker, a renegade from the Rothschild family, became a sculptor and an author. Extraordinary story, but they somehow, in 1973, they made it work for a bit.
Right.
Just a bit too well, possibly. Of course, it cost a bit of money.
Well, I mean, it doesn't work well, I think, because sadly what happens is that... there have been a couple of series of documentaries on the parole system, which have been on TV, which are really worth watching. Parole boards are extremely reluctant, almost never release people who have committed, serious violent crimes, murder, however much they are reformed. And actually, what I think this series revealed was how extensively mental health, counselling, really progressive things are now part of the prison system to get people to understand what they did and why it was wrong and to change.
Yeah.
And I really felt this came out extremely well in the programme, was that people are capable of recognising that what they did was wrong and changing, and in which case the rationale for holding people is no longer really there. But society has a problem releasing someone who has murdered someone because they're fearful of the cost of doing so. That if someone were to go out and do something terrible again, then it would be their responsibility. And I kind of understand that, but we really should be focusing on the fact that people can change. I think the system is one of punishment, and I think it kind of freezes people as, this person was a bad person and they remain a bad person and nothing can be done about it. But the other sad thing about the programme was that people who are, not convicted of serious crimes, just people who've fallen into a life where, a lot of it involves drugs, are released, but then they're released into a system that provides them no support to rebuild their lives. And it's extremely difficult, Most employers don't want to employ people who've got a prison record. You only find, I think, Timpson, the cobblers, I think he is well known for giving people a second chance.
Yes, you're right. Yeah.
But in general, it's it's really difficult. How are you going to get a job? And so there's not the investment in supporting people back into society, and this became sadly evident in the programme that people would be back in prison, within 6 months, within a year, because they couldn't handle it.
I guess it's the reason why I've met clients some years ago, but also more recently, who said they felt safer in prison because it actually provided them with a home environment, which, in other words, was broken or had been dilapidated due to their absence. Yeah.
Well, I think it's a kind of institution. It's an institution for people who are damaged in all kinds of ways. That they're being looked after, at least to that extent. If your life is so precarious outside of prison, and let's look at the number of people that are homeless through no fault of their own, just because things broke down and they end up homeless. If you're in prison, you've got a roof over your head and you're being fed.
Yes.
It's
the bottom line.
And institutionalising, people get institutionalised. They get used to that.
Yes.
So, it's a huge, huge problem, and it's good to see people tackling it.
Do you think somebody will take this on politically? I'm thinking about this in the context of what we might move on to talk about, which is the gung-ho nature of a lot of politicians these days, and the beginnings of the questioning of that. Certainly in a UK sense, for example, over Gaza. But administration after administration, Home Secretaries have said, lock them up and throw away the key.
Leading
among those potentially however deluded they may, the at least temporary success of reform in local elections.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see it changing without us actually getting a left-wing social reforming government.
It will have to be that.
Which kind of seems unimaginable, but you know, I think when Labour when Labour came into power, Starmer's Labour, the prison system was at the point of breaking, and I think what quietly happened, but I didn't hear much about it, was that they did release some prisoners simply because it was so overcrowded.
They did. You're right. At the beginning of the Storm administration.
Yeah, yes. And then you know, I think my feeling is that what happened with that is that they kind of quickly kind of tanked it and didn't use it as the basis for going further to say, like I started off by saying, why don't we start thinking about having a national conversation about why non-violent offenders are held in prison. They could be doing community service. There are all kinds of things that people could do to pay a debt to society that doesn't involve just banging them up in prison. Yeah. But you know, that's not going to happen. And you know, and I think another aspect of the imprisonment story, because it's a mentality, isn't it? Of are we as a society happy removing liberty from vast numbers of people? And if you're not, then another side of the story, which is also of huge importance now, is we are the only country in the Western world which is imprisoning people indefinitely who have had their asylum appeals refused. Yeah. These detention centres.
Story about modern slavery, which I used to work in. Just that people are staying with their captives because they think that this is going to happen.
Yeah, and and that's kind of unforgivable, really, and that's a huge story for us, which again the Labour government has just ignored.
Promised but didn't really deliver.
Well, when they took office, they were they were taking office against a failed Conservative government that had put all of its focus in the last few months that it was in power. I'd say the last 6 months on stopping the small boats. Do you remember? And actually, it just didn't work. I think there was a point that
spectacularly didn't work.
Well, it spectacularly didn't work, and it's weird because as we can see from reform, there is a massive capacity for people to be ushered into a belief that immigration is the greatest problem facing the UK. It clearly isn't. Yeah. All of our poverty and inequality comes from our pandering to massive corporate interests that are bleeding all the money away from everybody, and it's a distraction. It's very evidently nothing more than a distraction. But people soured on the Tories at that point. And then Labour came in, and then they had the opportunity to try and do something, but as with almost everything, they're not interested in doing everything. So I think they shut the Bibby Stockholm.
Because those very corporate interests.
Well, because they're not interested. I don't know what they think government is. If it doesn't appear to involve governing, it doesn't appear to involve tackling any difficult issue on which they might face any pushback. Well, that's the definition of cowardice to me.
Yeah. Notwithstanding the disability benefits reforms, but
again, I mean that's an absurd situation that they've got themselves into because of fiscal rules. We need to cut. Where can we cut? It's almost like they've just statistically decided that they need to save X amount, and these people will be the ones where they, it's just. That's what they have to do.
Well, you could say that some of this will constrain, if it goes ahead, will constrain people to the point of virtual imprisonment, or disempowerment.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm hoping, Andy, that there's going to be, a significant rebellion over this. What's supposed to happen in politics is that if your leadership becomes aloof and incapable of connecting to the people who have elected them, then when MPs engage with the public, they're hit with a barrage of criticism that is so severe that they have to go to the leadership and say, you have to do something about this. Our political survival depends on it. And I did see today that I think MPs have been talking to the Daily Mirror and have said...
Traditionally, an organ of the Labour Party, it's a slightly different base now.
But the great quote is from an MP who said, the feeling amongst MPs in the House now is that they're more worried about the public than they are about the whips. meaning the volume of criticism that they're getting from their own constituents.
Yeah.
It means that it's more significant for them to rebel than it is for them to, come under the whips, trying to, bludgeon them into voting for what Starmer and Reeves have come up with.
You think back to the Blair years, and they've been sort of the usual suspects have been wheeled out from that to talk about geopolitics in a piece today by Patrick Winter and the Guardian. But that was a rarity then, wasn't it? Because it was the idea that a sort of soft left, extremely soft left populism had been sold and had its shelf life, but it was effectively a Thatcherite continuity by another name. And that's supposedly what we've got now, isn't it, in a sense? And yet the public are getting wise again to the same old tropes. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I think there are so many different Britons at the moment, aren't there? So the biggest problem that we have, I'm sure we usually touch on it when we talk about things, is how there isn't a significant representation of left-wing views in the country. Left-wing views, people who are interested in socialism, who are interested in some kind of redistribution to make sure that what we don't have is a chronically poor underclass that is ever growing. But what we have in so many different ways now, and I think we saw this in the local elections, if you don't mind me moving on to that, is that we have 5 distinct political parties now in the UK who all have significant influence, and they have successes in different places depending on who they are. The first thing that suggests is that the first past the post system is absolutely unfit for purpose. And let's look at how swiftly Labour have fallen out of favour. So first of all, they got the most insane majority last summer in the general election. And they got that not because they won, but because the Tories lost. Yeah. The Tories lost, and then their vote was splintered with Reform, which suddenly came out of nowhere. It's not representative at all. The polling ever since then, I mean, I don't know whether you've been watching it, but it's just, Labour is just falling off a cliff. And the last projection I saw a few days ago was that they would lose 350 of their seats if a general election were to be held tomorrow.
Just a few months in.
Yeah. But, what the local election showed, obviously, everyone's fixated on Reform. And Reform clearly are taking a lot of the Tories' support, because the Tories are still in freefall, but they're also taking a lot of support from Labour. And there's a lot of, as much as Reform is a dangerous party, we can see that from their kind of Trump-like pronouncements, and from the fact that essentially their main focus is on persuading people that immigration is the biggest problem in Britain, and thinly disguised, if at all, just open racism against other people. There are also a lot of the voices that were coming out were people who are just sick of the broken nature of Britain, of the poverty and the inequality, and who are fed up with the traditional parties failing to address it, and they're doing that thing that people have also done in America with Trump, is falling for the lies that are told by a far-right figure who's got a magic wand and is going to make everything better. But what else came out in this was that, reasonably market towns that are doing reasonably well, that would have been Tory, they're kind of going Lib Dem. If you can locate an urban or even a rural town context in which a number of people are prepared to be radical, they're voting Green.
The signs that say "down with this sort of thing."
I think all 5 parties now have a significant presence in British politics. 2 of them are in freefall, which is Labour and the Tories, but Reform and the Liberal Democrats and the Greens are all a significant presence. And if we could wave a magic wand and have proportional representation for the next general election, we would start having coalition governments where different parties had to cooperate with each other, and everybody would be represented, and it would give people more incentive to vote, because their votes wouldn't be wasted, because most people's votes are wasted. If you come second, all those votes go in the bin. That's the situation that we're in, I think, and I'm hoping that reform fall apart. I think it's already started to happen. We've got councillors resigning because they apparently didn't understand what the job entailed.
And how little it pays. Yeah.
There are. I think I'm not sure, but I think it may turn out that some of the candidates were fictional. Certainly, some people. I've seen a few places where somebody stood, and then their family, other family members have stood for other councillor roles, and I mean, it's all going to collapse, I think, because they're incompetent. And most of them, when they open their mouths, say things that are just frankly unforgivable for most people.
But also don't play well on the 6 o'clock news sort of thing. That's the crucial thing, isn't it? At least not yet.
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think what I would say is that there's a disaffected minority in this country that are susceptible to far right messaging, and the question is how much of the population it is. Is it 20%? Is it 20 to 30%? Maybe at the absolute maximum. So there's obviously a majority of people who don't think like that at all.
But they're not as vocal.
Well, they're not being able to be represented properly because of a broken system.
Yes.
And then there's also, the problem of the huge numbers of people who don't vote at all. And proportional representation would, like I say, would encourage people to vote, because you could say to people, instead of your vote going in the bin when your guy comes second, or cumulatively, and if enough of you vote for a party or for a representative, you will get the seat.
Yeah.
You
would need probably a Liberal Democrat government to introduce electoral reform. I mean, Labour flirt with it, but it's really, they don't consider it's in their interest.
Well, I mean, they really should do it now.
Yeah.
But like I say, the problem goes to...
Do you think it would help them next time?
Well, I think they're going to be wiped out absolutely irrevocably. Yeah. The problem is that they're too arrogant to believe in anything apart from their own fantasies. Their fantasies are... We inherited a broken country, we've got no money, we have to tighten the belt, everybody will have to put up with it, things are going to get better. They're kind of empty techno-babble that they come up with about growth. It's completely meaningless. They think that they're going to persuade people that they had to do what was needed, and that people are going to come back to them in droves.
So
that's surely... They're living in a fantasy land.
It's sort of a bit Hollywood when you think about it, isn't it? But what you're saying is, at the point when Starmer got going, it would have been possible under Corbyn to look at this in an entirely different way, in a sort of a post-Keynesian way, where you have a 5-10 year plan, then you do a major round of public investment.
Yeah, and you have to do public investment, and you have to go after the rich, I think. I mean, given the damage that's been done to our country, that's probably why they're so awful, is that they've inherited the most broken neoliberal, unequal system that worse than anywhere in Western Europe. Yeah. And they said, we can't do anything about it. It's like, you have to think outside the box of how you're going to do something about it. Otherwise, people are going to conclude that you're no different. And that is what people have concluded.
So, we have... the Ys will have to start naming names. Would the Ys include the Lib Dems and the Greens? The Greens, of course, are prone to bifurcation on, in my humble opinion, daft things like the trans issue. Everybody's free to love who they love and all that, but that's the end of it, basically. I would have thought. Anyway, but given all that political weather, have either of those parties got the cojones to invest in a real progressive social agenda and sell it to the public?
Well, I think if so the question there is, like, what would happen if they had power?
That's what I'm asking, yes.
Because it's very easy to theorise when you're not in power. And the Liberal Democrats, I think, have somehow managed to bury the ghost of Nick Clegg, because of course when they did get into power with the Tories, they were an absolute disaster. They just sold out every principle they had, and they. And unfortunately, that whole situation where they tried to introduce proportional representation was just played by Cameron and the Tories to make it look like an idiotic idea, and they succeeded in that. But I think the left. So the left now consists of there's a couple of campaigns ongoing at the moment by 42 Labour MPs, I think around that number, both on calling David Lammy to account for continuing to sell arms to Israel while pretending that the British government isn't, and also for the disability cuts. Yeah. Now it's something like 40. So this is 1/10 of the Labour MPs currently are left-wing socialist MPs. These are good people, and we know who they are. Yeah, John McDonnell, and I mean, they're all worth looking at. All of these people are worth looking at. They're all good people. Their concern is for the people. Their concern is for justice. Then you've got Corbyn and the independent MPs, and independent MPs are going to carry on growing in numbers, I think. And then you've got the Lib Dems, and then you've got the Greens, and then you've got the SNP, you've got Plaid Cymru. Theoretically, what you've got is a large minority of people who, if they had access to power, would more or less share the same notions of thinking outside the box, doing things that are redistributive, essentially, because that nothing is more important than stopping the ever-growing increase of poverty at the bottom of society. It's just growing. This is like rising damp, corroding more and more of people who, 10 years ago would have been just about okay, and now really suffering. I mean, it's funny.
Abolition of the middle class.
Well, my wife and I just, were trying to work out what our outgoings were last week, so we looked at all our bills. They're staggering amount. We are paying more for energy in this country than any other country in the Western world. Then you've got council tax. Then you've got whatever you're paying for your comms, telephone and internet.
Which for you particularly essential.
Well, the grand total of everything is it's insane. Water, the water bills. Our water bill...
They're going to go up again, aren't they?
Our water bill went up nearly 30% this year. And not for any service,
water,
not for any service that's being provided by Thames Water. This is a criminal enterprise that has stolen all the money that was given to it by its customers, who cannot go to any other company. This is an absolute monopoly. This isn't like the freedom of choice that we allegedly have with electricity and gas, where we can move suppliers.
Yes.
It's a total scandal. But it went up from £550 to nearly £900.
Yes. Got very close to nationalisation a little while ago, but somehow or other the lawyers seem to have seen that off.
Well, again, the government, has looked at a bill which is a huge amount of money. But what they're not doing is looking outside the box. Recruit the cleverest lawyers and become pioneers in recruiting people to find angles to take down corporate profiteers as criminals. There is clearly a story here about what was supposed to happen when you privatise the water industry, that whoever is buying it is supposed to run the water industry. As they have so patently failed to do that, they have flooded us with sewage, they have taken all the money and given it to their shareholders without investing any money in what they're supposed to be doing. Clearly all of this is illegal at some level. But, that's what I would expect that a Corbyn government would have done, because, I remember that John McDonnell, when he was the Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, was bringing together all the best left-wing economists that he could to try and come up with a new notion of how we could run the world. And of course, they were just tarred as like, oh, these are dinosaur monsters from the 1970s, and if we allow them to do anything, then it will be the 1970s again. And that was so clearly not the case. But that was a successful message that was sold, because the entire establishment was determined to eliminate Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell from the picture, including the Labour Party.
Yeah. The interesting notion about, I'm wondering, this is why Corbyn has demurred from the idea of forming his own movement. Somehow he got momentum and whatnot, and Red Pepper, what used to be Red Pepper. But is that the idea of collaboration. In other words, you're identifying that there are people, there are small groups across the country, there are small groups that are getting significantly larger. And I think a couple of sessions ago we were trying to figure out how this atomization could begin to cohere. It rather sounds as if there's the bones of something here, that if it's sufficiently strategically under the radar, could have some traction, because you then have a case, you have a coherent case for feasible action.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting with Jeremy Corbyn that he has resisted calls to set up a party.
I wonder why that is. Why do you think it is?
Well, I think that it's probably better that it carries on being independents, so you get a coalition of independents, but only because there are so many places where independents are able to win. And my fear is that if a party was set up, and loads of candidates were put out all over the place, they just simply wouldn't win. Under a first past the post system, a lot of socialist alternatives in the past have always just been marginal fringe parties that, get 500 votes.
Yeah.
Turning that into something else, especially when what you're not doing, you don't want to take out the 40 good Labour MPs. You don't want to take out the Greens. You shouldn't want to take out decent Lib Dems. So it's a coalition of a collective of reasonably similarly like-minded people
coalition
from various parties.
Yeah.
So I mean, like the Liane Mohammed in Ilford, who I mean, I wish there was a general election tomorrow just to see Wes Streeting lose.
Yeah.
She doesn't need to stand for a party. She could stand for the anti-Wes Streeting party, but she can stand as an independent and win.
Such as the revirement in that.
And I think there'll be more of this if there are, as I suspect. I mean, I'm sure it's the case around the country. There are people who want to represent their local community, who are talking to their local community, who are asking their local community what they need, who are coming up with ideas about how, yes, I agree with you, everything is a horrible and unjust mess. What about if we try and do this, this and this? If you're reasonably charismatic and can do that, there's no reason you're not going to win as an independent, because everybody else is lying.
Yes. And it will become all the more obvious as people start doing their thing. It's interesting you say that, because it's the newest initiative of the Bernie AOC thing in the States, isn't it? This idea that people in the boondocks will run for office, and they're devising a toolkit for them to begin to hold their first sort of micro town halls and begin to state their case.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that the problem the States has got is that the Democratic Party is no longer in touch with the people. So they're it's the same as Starmer's problem here. Is he stands for nothing. He doesn't represent the people. He has no interest in the people. He's a warmonger. He's neoliberal. He's bought by every alarmingly wealthy corporate interest group going. And it's the same thing with you have to have a narrative to sell the public, and that Labour's got nothing. It turns out that Reform somehow does have a story to tell the public, which, if you look to the US election, that's what happened. Kamala Harris didn't have a message to sell to the American people about why they should get excited about voting for them. Trump did. Yeah. Trump had a malevolent message, and he had an incoherent message, and maybe it's extremely difficult now, I think, in a time when people's feelings are why they seem to be doing things, why they're voting for people, so what they feel about it. But if you're going to win, you have to enthuse the voters.
Feelings in the sense that you're citing them are almost always pejorative, aren't they?
Yeah.
Banned as filth and all that.
Yeah.
But effectively, it's that sense of uplift, that sense of. It's not so much charisma, as you say. It's a compelling narrative.
It's a narrative,
and it's odd, isn't it, that eludes what purports to be social democracy.
Well, because I think if you compare it with all of the left-wing MPs that I mentioned in the Labour Party, the socialists, we had a Guantanamo vigil outside Parliament, which we have every month.
Yes.
I had one on Wednesday, and because we've been working really hard to set up an all-party parliamentary group for the closure of the prison at Guantanamo.
How's that going?
And we said, it's going well, yeah. And we asked MPs to come down. And so they did, and so John McDonnell was there, and having a conversation with John McDonnell is having a conversation with somebody who is like, he's a recognisable human being who shares my concerns and values, and shares the concerns and values of millions of people.
There's no front on their side, is there? What you see is what you get.
Yes.
It's very refreshing.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And so, it's that. Those people have a narrative. And it's the left-wing socialist and environmental narrative that needs to be sold to people. And it's interesting that the Green Party, Zach Polanski, is now standing as leader. And Zach Polanski is a very good communicator. If anyone watches, he's the deputy leader at the moment, and he's in the GLA. But if you watch any of his stuff, he's on it.
Yeah.
And he's charismatic. He's intelligent. He is selling a narrative. He is selling a story, and he's campaigning on the notion that what the left needs is to find a way to combat the populism of the far right through a new populism of the left. And I think he's absolutely right in his intention, and whether he can do it or not is another matter. But it's interesting that it's arising.
Yeah. How do the bones of them differ? Because you're a stickler, quite rightly, for authenticity, keeping it real, keeping it, locally sourced, as it were, and standing for what you believe in, sticking with it. How will these things differ?
Between what?
Well, left-wing populism, what form might that take?
Well, left-wing populism, as far as I can see, would need to first of all start off by saying, we need money that governments are saying doesn't exist. So, we need to, someone needs to be brave enough somewhere in the West to increase the burden on the rich. We're now living in times of inequality that are kind of unparalleled almost in human history. I mean, a few years ago, the comparison was with the Edwardian era, when the gap between the rich and the poor was at its maximum.
Yeah.
But then you need to start going back into the Middle Ages and supreme monarchs, and the gulf between the rich and the poor is extraordinary, and so that has to be a priority. And so what that means is that you need to find the money then to support the things that people need. And everything that I would say, I would look at Labour to see what they're doing is wrong. So Labour is working with BlackRock, which is the biggest asset manager in the world, ever so quietly working with them on the basis that you've got all the money, so what if we just essentially privatise the UK and give it to you, and then you can run everything? I mean, I genuinely think that is the scale on which they've abdicated their responsibility, not just as a supposedly socialist party, but as responsible politicians. I think the scale of it is huge.
Yeah,
look what's happening with the NHS. Are they privatising the NHS as stealthily as they can? Yes, they are.
Well, we're told by the new incumbent that they've run out of money. We just have to deploy it better. We hear that quite a bit, don't we?
Yeah.
But the whole premise of this is that no, this is an absolute priority. Money can be found.
Yeah, well, absolutely. It always is, and it always has been. And Andy, I do suspect that because we never have conversations, we never have cross-border conversations about, for example, things work a lot better in Scandinavia because there's a higher taxation rate. We don't have conversations, and I thought it was going to start under Cameron and Osborne when they first started, seriously attacking the NHS. I thought, well, that's an obvious point for opposition to them. It shouldn't really take much to sell the story of why a system that is paid for through our collective tax, which makes it function as a service that is available to all of us when we're in need. If there is not enough money to run it as it is at the moment, then you sell a message that you need to specifically increase tax by X amount to make sure that the NHS is funded how it needs to be. And because that conversation hasn't really happened, because that case hasn't really been made forcefully enough, then it's as though it doesn't exist. And so that's why what we're seeing by stealth, by the lack of opposition,
by West Streeting,
is West Streeting and all of his deals with private companies, which is the same issue that it's always been, and which should be so transparently obvious by now that it doesn't work. If you give private companies who are driven by profit making control over public services, the public services are not going to get better. They're going to get more expensive, and they're going to get worse. And we should know that by now. And yet, somehow that message is still being... It's either they're doing it stealthily or they're pushing messages out to people that, this is the only way that it can be done. And it will be efficient. And
The trope with the NHS seems to be not fit for purpose. It's rolled out again and again, isn't it? Some of the so there you have, as it were, a sort of a small element of a narrative there that says that this is, broken Britain is another one, isn't it?
Yeah.
And therefore extreme measures which may happen to involve, painful modern economic realities.
Etc.
etc.
Well, there's definitely a point at which parts of the media, push out stories about when something has gone wrong in the NHS. With the notion being, if this was private, none of this would happen. When there's no evidence for that. I mean, my experience of the NHS is repeatedly in my life, and I have repeatedly had reasons to very fundamentally rely on the NHS for the very survival, actually, both of myself and of my wife and of my son. And the fundamental difference between that and the private system is that the people working in the NHS, so many of the people that I have met and encountered, believe that they are working for a public good, not for a business. It's hugely significant, that difference. As soon as you bring money into it, and all anyone needs to do is really, look at America, where literally you will be told your company will kill you, your health care insurance company will kill you because they don't want to spend money keeping people alive. It's the same as all the insurance rackets. If you're a car owner, you know that if something happens to your car, the position of the industry is that insurance is kind of a tax for their profits. They don't really want to pay out for anything. So they're going to try and stop paying out for the fact that something happened to your car that they should pay out for. Well, that's just a car. But imagine that's your own health and they're operating on the same basis. Then we're actually all disposable to a private healthcare system because we get in the way of profits. That's so alarming and so dangerous.
And if you compare that, say, to the disability welfare cuts and the very idea of individual autonomy and personal agency, it's kind of fundamental, isn't it, to being a citizen, being an empowered citizen.
Yeah, well, I think they deserve to fall for this one. I mean, in the way that what's happened in the States is that I think, apart from anything else that's happening, what Trump did with tariffs is a moment that has destroyed him, essentially, because it has made so many people think this guy's not.
Nuts.
And I think the disability cuts that Labour is still adamant about pushing through is that moment for them. This is like, no, this is cruel.
And it's come early in both political cycles, which are more or less neck and neck, aren't they, as a special relationship and all that.
Yeah, but I am hopeful that will be the case, Andy, because the most vulnerable people in society, whatever they cost, and what they cost is a fraction of what is being spent on all kinds of other things that aren't necessary. We've got a prime minister now who, if he could, would be ramping up on a daily basis our expenditure on defence, because he's a warmongering lunatic. He really is. If you, as any type of party, I mean, the Tories the Tories tried to do this and were stopped. And the Tories, obviously, the Tories were what used to be known as the nasty party, and there are a lot of reasons why the Tories were known as the nasty party. But if you deliberately impoverish massively the most vulnerable people in society, what on earth is your purpose as a government? Really? I mean, the fact that they don't see it is just beyond me, and it goes back to what I was saying. I don't think these are very nice people. I think the journey that they have been on to get rid of the socialists, to get rid of Jeremy Corbyn, to get into power, the witch hunts that they've run against everybody and everything, the suspicion that they have of everybody and everything, the authoritarianism that is at the heart of so many of them, which, when I grew up, Thatcher's authoritarianism was terrible, but there was a libertarianism in old school Tories.
Yeah, it was.
And there's always been a kind of Stalinist streak in Labour. So what you get now is neoliberal, modern Labour people whose only point at which they're Stalinist is their horrendous authoritarianism towards people. It's a disaster. If they have no heart, it seems to me. People are going to see that in vast numbers. They're going to go, these people appear to be heartless. And that's not a good look.
There's a whole paradox here. If you take the disability paradigm, in the day job a few years ago, I found myself spending the best part of, I think, 18 months, almost full-time, on personal independence payment tribunals, helping the limping and the fibromyalgic up long stairs in anonymous grey blocks of various places. And, presenting expert witness reports. And, of course, the other side have to employ their own legal people, often on a freelance basis, and a sort of retired JP. All this has to be paid for. As far as I could tell, this long saga, often over a couple of years or more, was costing more than anything they might save.
Well, there is that as well.
It's quite a lunatic endeavour, really.
Well, it is, but it's funny when you were talking about that, because I'm realising how long this has been going on. That, I remember when the Tories, when the Tories had Atos, and were waging war on the disabled. So their starting point was, all these people are pretending. They're all pretending to be disabled. That was a scandal that I think did them damage. And for it to have a Labour government that hasn't learnt anything, that really just ring fence disability, just allow people to be disabled because they are. Stop you're poking spears into this vulnerable group of people all the time, going like, "Are you pretending? How ill are you?" It's horrific.
And it plays oddly in a world that's become more diverse, whereby people have been empowered to. I mean, my landlady goes around on a mobility scooter, and we're seriously considering entering her the Le Mans Rally. I mean, she's frail, but there's an inner toughness that you sort of need if you've got that situation. Now, she was given 6 months to live 30 years ago.
Right.
So she will probably outlast all of us, I suspect. But at the same time, her life should be made as comfortable as possible, surely.
Yeah. And I think what's also shocking about this is, if Reform were ever to get power, and I'm really hoping that they don't, but they're going to take a Trumpian line about just cutting everything. And if we look at what's happening in the United States, tariffs is the one that's really hit people. But I think before that, and perhaps this is also as deep, is that, by empowering Musk and these degenerate children of his to go into the entire apparatus of the federal government and to randomly start shutting things down and sacking people, is that all the safety nets that protect us at all kinds of levels are just being cut away by people who are basically saying, in the most extreme way possible, and especially in the States, this is a nation of self-sufficiency. You need to be able to stand on your own 2 feet, and if you can't, I don't know why on earth you should expect that the government will do anything for you. And that might sound good as a soundbite, and it's one that has resonance in the United States psyche that it doesn't have in Europe. But the practical realities are, when everything starts being cut, all the most vulnerable people are not being supported in any way. I mean, the scale of it could be so immense and so damaging that I think that has also had psychic repercussions across the United States already, which has damaged Trump. So what Starmer is doing is part of that. It's part of cutting the safety net. And yet the far right would be even worse if reform were to get in. I can imagine them just cutting everything. How dare you have, to try and normalise the notion where if these people aren't stopped, then within a few years they'll be talking about, well, why is the state paying pensions to people? People need to make their own provision for their own pensions, and if they haven't, then it's obviously because they were eating too much smashed avocado on toast, or not that they were actually poor. Do you know what I mean? Because because the elements of the welfare society, which started in the late 19th century, as we were discussing when we were talking about the Quakers, and that Thatcher did so much to destroy, and that have been under assault so much over the last 40 years. Bits of the welfare state are left. Bits of the state are left that say we ought to look after people to at least some level, rather than just allow it all to be the law of the jungle. And
we still have an ageing population, Andy, and they're not particularly in power, but they are vocal if you start talking to them, and we are sort of on the cusp of that ourselves, aren't we? Really?
Yeah. And the big problem, I mean, that's a huge problem that no one wants to talk about, is the care of the elderly. So, as it stands, we have two Britons at the moment. One is the people who have assets, so, they bought a house, they have savings. Those are all, it seems, across the country now, all going into, paying places that cost thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds a week to keep them alive at the end of their lives. And then we don't hear much about older people who are poor, who are obviously having to be looked after in council-run care homes. But that's going to increase exponentially, because the richest generation is probably the one now. It's not going to be the one in future, because in future the proportion of people with, generous pensions is going to get smaller. I mean, I come across it sometimes. I come across adverts that just say, how we can help you have £1 million in your retirement. Because that's what, if you want to live in the manner to which you have become accustomed, and you're going to live for 25 years after you've retired, you need £1 million.
You do.
While not working, which is like, what is that? That's like winning the lottery.
Yes, of course, Nigel Farage turns up at your door, doesn't he, with some sort of Ponzi scheme?
Oh, exactly.
Yes. I think we need to talk about Gaza a little bit, don't we? And I have to say, I have the image in the Gorniet is the one on Al Jazeera that I just had to look away from. That little girl in agony and sheer disbelief and terror with her younger sibling, who hopefully is still alive. We don't know if they still are. We now have a thing called, what's it called, Operation Gideon's Chariot, which sounds to be like the psychotic last gasp, the final solution.
Yeah, it does feel like the final solution is the adequate explanation for what Israel is planning. I mean, it's beyond belief. 15 and a half months of a relentless genocidal assault, followed by 6 weeks of a ceasefire, which was then willfully and deliberately broken by Israel. First of all, with a total siege that's been going on now for more than 2 months. Total siege. No food, no water, no medicine, no fuel. A resumption of the attacks on the Palestinians still in the Gaza Strip. So relentless bombing campaigns, where Israel doesn't appear any longer to be trying to claim that there's a necessary military component to that, because they've kind of said this is all about encouraging Hamas to give up the rest of the hostages, which was part of the ceasefire deal if Israel hadn't broken it. But now it's like, no, now we need to kill civilians and starve them as much as possible to force Hamas to give up the hostages. And then now it's morphed into the latest plan, and this is the one where I think people around the world are starting to turn, because it's so horrific. The complete military occupation of Gaza, which was always a no-no. I mean, the West, however hypocritical it may have been, Western politicians have known that they can't allow Israel to do that they have to keep hopes alive for some kind of peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians, so that the Palestinians have their own land. So that's crossing a huge red line. But the starvation is continuing, and now they're saying we want to cram the remaining population into a small area in the south, which will be where aid will be given to them, but only in sufficient levels to keep them from starvation. Yeah. It's like 1/10 of the amount of aid that needs to come in, and the entire concentration camp, because that's what it is, will involve everybody there has to submit to providing their details and being only having access to food through retina scans. I mean, it's a techno-futuristic concentration camp, which will be run by US mercenaries. Sorry? And then the other part of the story is that they're talking about how they're very willing and hopeful of facilitating the voluntary migration of the population. And what I find the most alarming part of this story, Andy, is that when you don't drill down into what's being presented and you just look at, they said this, it's like, well, I'm sure, it's not great, is it? And it's not really what should be happening. But under those circumstances, yes, people will leave. They can't leave. There is no way for people to leave. So the far right, which is the one that's been pushing voluntary migration for a long time now, are hanging it there but yes, but it's kind of humanitarian. It doesn't even exist. It's a lie. It's a lie behind which they will continue to slaughter the Palestinians through bombing and starvation, because there is no way out of Gaza. And that's the bit that no one's answering. Egypt and Jordan have both said categorically, we cannot be seen to endorse the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. What people don't understand is that support for the Palestinians amongst the populations of Egypt and Jordan is very strong. And it could very well destabilize those regimes if they were to support the Israelis' complete ethnic cleansing of Palestine. It's that significant. So both of them said no. The Israelis have been pushing them. When they started their genocidal assault in October 2023, Netanyahu obviously thought, what we're doing is so intense that these guys are going to have to. They're going to have to open the border. They didn't. Trump came in and immediately started saying, well, we need to sort out Egypt and Jordan. No, they say no. Repeatedly, persistently, they say no. Who else is going to take in people from Gaza, Andy? Our countries in the West, which are the best place to take them, are more fanatically racist and anti-immigrant than they have ever been in living memory. They're not going to take them in. They might take in a few dozen here and there. There are 2 million people in Gaza. So this plan is so inhuman that that's why, I think something's going to happen. I think, a Tory MP stood up the other day who said, I've supported Israel for 20 years. I've done everything that I can to support Israel. I completely understand now that everything I believed in was wrong. Criticism is coming from, I've seen over the last few days from prominent Jewish American journalists writing about, it's crossed a line. It's crossed a line. So I don't know what's going to happen. And of course, Trump's about to go to the Middle East, and we're getting mad mixed messages. Mixed messages. The US supports the concentration camp aid plan on the one hand. On the other hand, Trump doesn't look like he's even interested in going to Israel and meeting Netanyahu on his latest trip. I know that Donald Trump doesn't like Benjamin Netanyahu because Benjamin Netanyahu is at least as arrogant and self-important as Donald Trump is. But for Donald Trump,
yes,
you need to get down on your knees and say to him, you are the almighty, powerful, most powerful man on earth. You do not meet him eye to eye like Netanyahu. And Netanyahu, with a whole history of treating the Americans as their bitches. So I'm wondering, Andy. I'm really hoping that on that basis, Trump might do one of those unexpected things because he's created a world of total chaos. No one knows what he's going to do. No one knows when he's going to change his mind. No one knows anything.
This particular corner of Broccoli does. Andy, thank you very much, as ever.
You're welcome, Andy.